Imagine a war that no longer announces itself. No declarations, no front lines, only signals. On a quiet Saturday, the United States sent one of those signals. More than 90 precision strikes, dozens of targets, a message written in fire. This was not about territory. It was about memory, about retaliation, about reminding the world that some lines still matter. I want you to pause here, because this moment is easy to misread. It looks like routine counterterrorism. It sounds like familiar language, but listen closely. This is not the beginning of a war. That sentence matters. So does the one that follows. What we are witnessing is something colder, more deliberate, a form of power designed not to conquer, but to deter. If you care about how modern conflict really works, stay with me. Because to understand these strikes, we must first understand the system that made them inevitable. And that story begins earlier. What exactly is the problem the United States is trying to solve here? On the surface, the answer seems simple. A terrorist attack, American soldiers killed. A response follows. But that explanation is incomplete. The real issue is not ISIS alone. It is what happens when a state collapses and no one fully replaces it. Syria today is not at war in the old sense. It is something more fragile, a country without a clear center of gravity. In that space, armed groups survive, they adapt, they wait. For Washington, this creates a permanent dilemma. Ignore these actors and risk more attacks. Strike too hard and risk escalation in a region already saturated with conflict. So the question becomes strategic, not emotional. How do you punish without occupying? How do you deter without governing? How do you show resolve without starting a new war? This operation is an answer to those questions. Not a perfect one, but a revealing one. To see why, we need to step back. We need to look at how Syria arrived at this moment in the first place. To understand this moment, we have to rewind the clock. Syria did not collapse overnight. It eroded year by year, crisis by crisis. For more than a decade, the country was defined by civil war. Power fractured, institutions hollowed out, territory changed hands again and again. Then came a decisive break. The fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime ended the war on paper, but it did not restore the state. What replaced it was something far more unstable. A patchwork of authorities, former rebels turned rulers, foreign powers protecting interests, not borders. In that vacuum, extremist groups never truly disappeared. They adapted to weakness. They learned to survive without controlling cities. Smaller cells, quieter operations, deadlier surprises. This is the hidden cycle of modern conflict. When wars end without institutions, violence does not stop. It changes shape, and for outside powers like the United States, this creates a recurring problem. No enemy army to defeat, no capital to capture, only shadows that strike and retreat. That unresolved history sets the stage for what comes next. Because when one attack breaks the pattern of containment, escalation becomes unavoidable. Then came the moment that shattered the balance. An ambush in the Syrian desert. Sudden, lethal, personal. 2 American soldiers were killed, alongside a civilian interpreter. Not in a major battle, not in a dramatic offensive, but in the quiet spaces where wars are supposed to be over. This is what made the incident different. It was not symbolic violence, it was targeted, and it crossed a line the United States rarely ignores. For ISIS, the attack was a test, a probe, a signal of survival. For Washington, it was a failure of deterrence. And failures of deterrence demand correction. This is where policy hardens. Emotion gives way to doctrine, and doctrine demands action that is unmistakable. Operation Hawkeye Strike was not rushed. It was scaled, measured, overwhelming by design. More than 35 targets, over 90 precision munitions, a coalition of aircraft filling the sky. The goal was not revenge alone. It was to erase uncertainty, to remove any doubt about consequences. But every escalation carries meaning beyond the battlefield. And once forces use this visibly, the system reacts. To understand why this response took this form, we have to look beneath the surface. Because the real story is not the strike itself. It is the machinery behind it. What sits beneath this operation is a system most people never see. Modern American power no longer revolves around occupation. It revolves around access, speed, and precision. Operation Hawkeye Strike reveals that logic clearly. This was not a surge of troops. It was a demonstration of reach. Aircraft launched, coordinated, struck, and vanished. Targets were selected not for symbolism, but for function. Weapon sites, logistics nodes, command infrastructure. This is how deterrence works now. Not by holding ground, but by denying capability. The message is simple, even if the method is complex. You may hide, you may disperse, but you cannot disappear. What makes this system effective is also what makes it dangerous. It lowers the threshold for action. When force is precise and distant, it becomes easier to use and easier to repeat. This is not escalation by accident. It is escalation by design, controlled, calculated, legally framed, but systems have consequences. Each strike reshapes incentives. Each success invites adaptation. And when adversaries adapt, pressure builds again. That pressure does not stay abstract. It moves outward, toward the next crisis, toward the next test. Because when deterrence is restored through force, it rarely stays quiet for long. The second crisis does not explode in one moment. It accumulates. Between late December and the end of the month, US forces moved again. And again, and again, nearly 25 ISIS members were killed or captured. 11 missions, relentless pressure. Then came something larger, a massive joint strike, American and Jordanian forces acting together. More than 70 targets across central Syria, fighter jets, attack helicopters, artillery, over 100 precision munitions. This was not a response to a single attack. It was a campaign. And that distinction matters. Campaigns signal intent. They say this is not episodic. This is sustained. For ISIS, the message was brutal clarity. Survival now meant constant movement, constant exposure, no safe rhythm. For regional actors, another message emerged. The United States was not leaving the board, not yet, not quietly. But here is the tension. The more persistent the pressure, the more the conflict stretches in time. And stretched conflicts blur lines between defense and dominance, between deterrence and permanence. This is the paradox of modern counterterrorism. Success requires repetition, but repetition creates expectation. And once expectations form, restraint becomes harder to sustain. That is when the consequences begin to reach beyond militants and militaries. They reach people. Now, let me shift the lens away from strategy, away from aircraft and targets, toward you, because every strike echoes downward. If you live in a fragile state, air power feels abstract until it doesn't, until roads close, until markets empty earlier than usual, until the night sounds different. You are not choosing sides. You are navigating uncertainty. Counterterrorism campaigns promise protection, but they also prolong tension. They keep societies suspended, not at war, not at peace. For ordinary Syrians, this means something very specific. No clear future, no stable recovery, only pauses between shocks. And here is the emotional truth. Policymakers rarely say out loud. Security for one group often feels like instability for another. This is where the moral weight of power settles. Not in press statements, but in daily life. If you wonder why resentment survives even after militants are weakened, this is why. Because fear does not disappear when bombs stop falling. It lingers. If this perspective matters to you, stay engaged. Stay questioning. Because understanding power is the first step toward holding it accountable. And to see the full picture, we have to zoom out even further. From individuals to the world, when the United States strikes in Syria, the shockwave does not stop at Syria's borders. Every missile carries a geopolitical signal to allies, to rivals, to actors watching quietly from the margins. Jordan's participation matters. It signals alignment, regional cooperation, a shared red line against instability spilling outward. But others are watching too. Russia, Iran, non-state actors who measure credibility, not rhetoric. In a post-Assad Syria, influence is fluid. Power is no longer centralized. It is negotiated through presence, pressure, and persistence. That is why these strikes resonate globally. They reinforce a familiar American role, not as a nation rebuilding states, but as a power enforcing boundaries. This shapes behavior far beyond ISIS. It affects how militias calculate risk, how partners hedge their alliances, how rivals test limits elsewhere. The world absorbs these actions as precedent. What happens here becomes a reference point there. This is how local conflicts globalize, not through conquest, but through signaling. And once signaling replaces stability as the currency of order, the future becomes harder to predict. Which brings us to the final question. Where does this path lead? Okay, the future now branches into three possible paths, not predictions, scenarios. The first is controlled deterrence. Strikes remain precise, targets remain limited. ISIS is kept fragmented, reactive, contained. Violence does not disappear, but it stays below a dangerous threshold. This is stability without peace. Manageable, fragile, familiar. The second path is erosion. Operations continue, but deterrence slowly weakens. Cells adapt faster than they are removed. Attacks return sporadically, each one smaller, each one politically costly. Here, the system does not fail dramatically. It degrades quietly. The third path is escalation. One strike misfires politically. One attack kills more than expected. Regional actors respond indirectly. Lines blur, retaliation widens. What began as counterterrorism becomes entanglement. This is the hardest truth of modern power. Systems designed to prevent war can still drift toward it. None of these paths is chosen outright. They emerge from repetition, from habits, from moments when restraint is tested. And that is why this story is not really about Syria. It is about how force shapes the future, one decision at a time. To understand what that means for all of us, we have to bring it home. So let me end where this story truly lives. Not in Syria, not in command rooms, but in the choices powerful countries normalize. What you have seen is not a single operation. It is a pattern, a way of managing danger without resolving it. Precision replaces presence. Retaliation replaces resolution. Force becomes maintenance. This works until it doesn't. Because the more often power is exercised this way, the more invisible it feels. And invisible power is rarely questioned, rarely debated, rarely constrained. That is the insight I want you to sit with. Modern conflict no longer shocks us into attention. It hums in the background, sustained, normalized, perpetual, and that should unsettle you, because systems that run quietly are the hardest to stop. If this analysis sharpened how you see global power, stay with this channel. Question the patterns, follow the next chapter, because the future will not be shaped by one dramatic war. It will be shaped by many small decisions, made far away, but felt everywhere. And the most dangerous moment is not when missiles fly. It is when we stop noticing them at all.